We love Avatar: The Last Airbender, and there's a multitude of reasons why. Main one being, this story was just done right. From the art and the design of the characters, to the music, to the time put into the world building, to the burst of creative cultures that we saw everywhere that we went, you can just see the time and the care that was put into this. And it's reflected in its rewatchability and its staying power. Avatar: The Last Airbender came out in 2005, and when it was released last year on Netflix, it still jumped right up to #1 like it came out yesterday. And its live action did the same exact thing. So today I want to talk about one of the main reasons why the show is received so well: the characters. Specifically, Aang. Funny enough, even though the show is named after him, it feels almost odd to call him the main character. The story focuses so much on the main cast, and he isn't really the one that drives the story forward. Because of this, whenever discourse is had around the show, Aang is oftentimes left out of the shuffle in favor of characters such as Katara, Zuko, Azula, Iroh, and Toph. And don't get me wrong, all of those characters are awesome, but every character has a role to play in the show. And if Aang didn't play his role so perfectly, these other characters wouldn't have shined so much. Aang is a reactionary character. He's a pacifist. He does not force the issue, and he doesn't go anywhere looking for trouble. Oftentimes, main characters of shows like this are active characters. They have a dream and they pursue it. Think Naruto in Naruto. He wants to be acknowledged by the village and therefore wants to become the Hokage. So he pursues becoming a shinobi. He takes part in the Chunin exams, and he looks forward to anything that can increase his strength because that increases the likelihood of him becoming the Hokage. Aang, on the other hand, already has acknowledgement and responsibility thrust upon him, and he doesn't want it. He only wants peace and to enjoy his friends. Most of the first season is Aang just trying to enjoy his life and enjoy his time with Katara and Sokka, but it being interrupted by the Fire Nation and by Zuko, forcing him to pursue his responsibility. Once again, this is different from a Goku who went out to try and find all the Dragon Balls for a wish, or a Tanjiro who picks up a sword because he knows he wants to kill somebody. Aang does not have that strong goal. He has a strong responsibility that he tries to run from but can't. Aang is allowed to differ from these other protagonists so strongly because the story is set up in a way that supports that character. And by supports, I mean that Aang doesn't have to push the story forward. The story will continue and move along with or without him because the Fire Nation and Zuko are the ones who push the story forward in most cases. And Aang's heart and compassion for people is what drags him into that. It's what forces him to react to that, and therefore drags him along, forcing him to take part in the story, which is another important piece to who Aang is. While he is a reactionary character, he cannot be 100% reactionary. Aang remembers these things that happen, and as these moments build up that made him react in the moment, that builds his reasoning for being committed to what he has to do in the future. He gains that drive from these actions that are taken against him and his friends. Aang remembers seeing the ashes of Monkey Atso at the Eastern Air Temple. Aang remembers hurting Katara when he was first learning how to firebend. And he saw what happened when he had to flee Omashu because he didn't have the strength to hold them off. Aang doesn't forget these things, and it becomes his motivation, his drive to stay focused and committed to his responsibilities. This is what separates Aang from a character like Gohan. Gohan is also a pacifist, and he's also a reactionary character. However, oftentimes, whenever Gohan is done with his reaction to that specific situation in the moment, he then returns right back to his old ways. He never seems to remember the lesson that he has to train in order to be ready for the next catastrophe that may take place. Aang does not have that problem. Aang is the perfect example of how you handle a pacifist main character in an action-packed adventure, and even has a surprising amount of character development, especially for a flat character. A lot of shows go wrong by having their protagonist be perfect from the start. They have them save every person, they win every ideological debate, and while you do want your main character to come off as capable, you don't want them to come off as too perfect and disconnected from the audience. This takes away the ability to humanize them. In Avatar: The Last Airbender, Aang has a really good balance in this. While he is very mature, Aang is still a child. And we see that when he runs away from the elders in the episode The Storm, or how he reacts to Appa being taken away, or even when he burned Katara while firebending. His emotions do get the best of him from time to time, and those moments of anger or irresponsibility connect us to the character even more. These things don't happen just over stupid things, they happen over things that matter to Aang, and that's what allows us to connect to him, because most of the time he has his emotions in check. Most of the time he's being considerate, but every now and then he slips up, just like we do. Aang's heart for others, combined with him actually making mistakes and remembering those mistakes and moving forward and changing because of them, is what makes Avatar: The Last Airbender such an emotional story. Of course, Aang isn't the only member of the cast that has these moments happen, but because he's the main character, what affects Aang affects everybody else, and therefore, when it happens to him, it makes the story as a whole more emotional. It doesn't just attach you to Aang, it attaches you more to the entirety of the show. Speaking of the entirety of the show, you can't fully dive into Aang's character without talking about his relationship with the other characters. Starting with Aang's foil, Zuko. Zuko is the exact opposite of Aang. Aang looks innocent, Zuko looks damaged. Aang runs away from the glory, Zuko runs towards it. And while Aang always wants to talk and see a possibility of becoming friends with Zuko no matter what he has done, Zuko isn't here for it. Zuko is exactly what a character like Aang needs, because Zuko is the one who pushes the story forward. Every time he is on screen early on in the series, something is going to happen, either bad for the main cast or bad for somebody else. Something that I feel isn't discussed enough when talking about Zuko is the fact that while he was a true danger to Katara, Sokka, and any village that he came across really, he wasn't a threat to Aang, more or less for the entire series. From their first encounter, Aang is shown to be stronger, and that gap is never closed. But we see, early on, Aang's unwillingness to confront Zuko causes harm to a lot of people. Villages, towns, and his crew. Really, everybody in the main cast has to get burned by Zuko or someone else in order to go through this hardening process that just turns them into more grown and mature characters. By the time Zuko has finally accepted his true nature and is willing to join the gang, they've gone cold to it. While the rest of the gang is completely against it, Aang looks to them for reassurance and blasts them out the temple. I mention this to say that Aang started off the show completely naive, and his trusting nature of everybody is what hardens him throughout the show. Ultimately, it hardens everyone else as well, but it's very noticeable from the joy-filled breath of fresh air that Aang is. It is a slow process, but Aang has to learn boundaries and he has to learn to embrace confrontation. Now, it would never become Aang's preferred method of resolution, but it has to be something that he's okay with. Early on, he had a tendency to not even attack his opponents. He would strictly evade and let them damage themselves, but he would never even raise a hand towards these enemies. And while the Airbenders did teach him to never start a fight, he was never taught to avoid ending a conflict. In order to protect others and to be a leader, you have to find a way to bring about a resolution, and Aang just didn't know how to do that, and so he always ran from problems, literally and figuratively. This is why it works so well and we're not caught off guard when the conversation finally comes up of what is Aang going to do when he fights the Fire Lord. On top of all of Aang's training to actually be strong enough to defeat him one-on-one, he has to be able to resolve that conflict permanently. And while these more difficult conversations and situations were normally taken up by Aang's older, more calloused group, they wouldn't be able to aid him here either because they each had their own jobs to do during this final battle of the war. For all of the character development that he went through throughout the series, all the small nuances that changed in him, and all the things that just make him seem like a more adult person, the biggest problem was never faced or addressed. The closest we came was while he was learning how to earthbend with Toph, where he had to stand there and face that rock, stand there and face confrontation. This gave him that confidence and that reassurance to go out there and start the battle, but it still didn't address how to finish it. And then when he talks to all of his past lives even so that they can understand, he sees that there just isn't really a way around it. Now, as far as they handled Aang's conflict in the show here, some people call it a cop-out, others don't. It was cleaned up due to the Avatar Chorus series, but I can see both sides. For however you feel about how they ended off the series with his final conflict, you cannot ignore all of the growth that he went through. You can't ignore that he's not the same person at the end of the show as he was at the start of it. While he might have the same heart, it has been hardened a little bit. He has learned to embrace conflict, and he has learned to lead a team. He's okay with the fact that what comes with the job is sometimes hurting people, and that no matter what, you have to keep pushing forward. He learned you can't just keep running away, and so he doesn't. And we were there for every lesson, no matter how small or how hard it was. And we saw him grow from it. And he never took a step backwards, always forwards. And that is what makes his character great.